Hello class, welcome back to Philosophy, Introduction to Philosophy. Today we're going to do doing chapter 12, John Stuart Mill and Utilitarianism. This should be a relatively short lecture, hopefully, if I don't get all caught up with it. But anyways, let's begin with John Stuart Mill and Utilitarianism. Uh, this guy's a pretty good comparison to Immanuel Kant, the guy we were talking about last time. So Immanuel Kant is all about the ontological, deontological ethical theory, his categorical imperative. So Immanuel Kant, it's all about the action itself. Doesn't care about the consequence, just cares about the action. Whereas John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism is all about the consequences, about the end result. So it's a teleological theory of ethics that determines whether something is good or wrong, an action is good or bad, determined based upon its end results. And what is going to be the end result? Happiness, the greatest amount of happiness for everyone involved. That's basically the principle of utility. That is the core of this theory called utilitarianism. And the principle of utility is this: maximum amount of good for maximum amount of people. So, so the rightness or wrongness of an action is to be judged solely by its impact on the people involved. So this kind of alludes back to Epicureanism. So utilitarianism holds that the greatest goal, or the ultimate goal for humanity, is happiness and the avoidance of pain. This is almost the same thing as the hedonistic theory by Epicurus. So Epicurus says that the same thing, you know, the avoidance of pain and the increase of happiness. And again, here hedonism is not what today's word means. So in today's society, hedonism has like a bad rap. Excuse me. As I just like physical, sensual pleasures. But according to Epicurus and these utilitarians like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, it's not just about happiness based upon just physical, sensual pleasures. It's like a bigger, transcendent type of happiness. So let's talk about John Stuart Mill for a little bit. So John Stuart Mill is not your typical individual. His father, for better or for worse, he was a philosopher. Mm, he was a philosopher at I think Oxford University, or one of the big universities in London, and he homeschooled John Stuart Mill. So he learned Greek at the age of 3. He learned Latin by the age of 8, and by the age of 10, he had read 6 of Plato's dialogues. So intensive homeschooling that he got. He actually was sheltered from other kids, not allowed to play, just study. Um, so poor little John Stuart Mill, didn't have really a childhood. It was all about study, right? And he was really bright. Um, Later on in life, he himself says that he was never a boy, that he never had childhood. And he kind of resented that for a while. In 1818, so John Stuart Mill was born in 1806. In 1818, um, what was his James James Mill, the father, James Mill, um, he wrote this really extensive and very intensive history of India. So during this time period, the British Empire is expanding across the world. And India is one of its main targets. So in 1818, James Mill, the father of John Stuart Mill, he publishes this book about the history of India, and he gets a government position to be the assistant examiner of the East India House. And the East India House is the precursor to the East India Company, which is going to be the imperial arm in colonizing India for the British Empire. So the whole family moves out to India for a long time. And then at the age of 17, John Stuart Mill, via the connections of his father, he also gets a job there with the East India House. Now it's the East India Company. And he works there for about 34 years, John Stuart Mill. And he becomes like the head of that department, the assistant examiner of India. And then, so anyways, that's just like his main job, being this colonial administrator in India. But during that time, though, in 1826, at the age of 20, John Stuart Mill kind of goes into this heavy depression, this breakdown, this mental breakdown. And he pretty much realizes that, he's just not happy. Something's wrong. He's just not happy. And he kind of blames it on his childhood. So he kind of like, he's all rigorous, right? It's all like, scientific rigor. So he takes a break, he takes a vacation, and he goes and, I think he goes to France, and he begins to read all these romantic writers. So all these British poets and writers, like what do I have here? Coolidge, right? What other romantic writers do we have? Oh, I can't think of right now anything. Well, these romantic writers, it's that they're about poetry and about nature and about romanticism. So he kind of sees that as the antidote. Like he's like so logical, he's like so vigorous about science and academia that he goes like a whole couple of years just reading poetry, just to get that romantic side again, right? To get that non-logical, that non-rational side of it. So he does that, and he comes to a realization. Right? And before I go forward, I must say that one of his tutors was this guy named Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was a philosopher, a scholar there, worked with with James Mill, and Jeremy Bentham had this theory of classical utilitarianism. He's the one that really developed that, and it's about that greatest happiness for the greatest amount of people. And John Stuart Mill, bought into that, but with this depression, he kind of figured out. He figured out that that's not enough. That Jeremy Bentham's theory is inadequate and too simplistic. We need to fix things. So let me talk about Jeremy Bentham's now. I guess theory, and then I'll finish off with John Stuart Mill. So Jeremy Bentham is known as a proponent of classical utilitarianism, and it's just that, maximize happiness. He has this thing that he calls a hedonistic calculus, where it's like this kind of like a formula, where you decide what's good or bad for you, or just basically what's good or bad, determining on how much amount of happiness it's going to bring to everybody. That's the basic principle. It's pretty straightforward. Whatever results in the greater overall well-being, or what you call utility, is well-being for the people involved, That's the right action. And then there's like two types of utilitarianism. There's act utilitarianism, and then there's rule. And act utilitarianism is just simply that. Like every action, every act that you do, every action, you apply that principle of utility. Greatest happiness for the greatest amount of people. With rule utilitarianism, there's like an extra step. When you're about to act, when you're about to perform an action, you don't determine the consequences of that action itself, but what you do is that you determine the consequences of the rule that guides that action. So, let's say, let me give you, I guess, an example here that they have in the textbook is about euthanasia, which is like mercy killing or voluntary killing, where somebody's in pain and they just rather die, just end the suffering. So in active utilitarianism, you might conclude that it's a right action, right? It's going to increase the happiness for everybody. Namely, the person who's in pain, that suffering is gone. Yeah, perhaps like the family members might hurt a little bit, but they're not going to continue hurting and watching him suffer or her suffer. Right? It's just going to be like one hurt and then it's gone. Right? So overall, that action seems like it's going to give you the better happiness for everybody involved. In rural utilitarianism, the same example of euthanasia, of mercy killing, might give you a different result. Because in rural utilitarianism, you gotta look for a rule that guides that action. So you gotta like look for a rule or like make up a rule that says it's okay for people to do euthanasia, and that's a rule that we should follow. So then, what happens here? The argument, the counter argument here is that if we consistently follow such a rule, that euthanasia is allowed, then the consequences might not be that great. Right? The consequences might be that you might start doing euthanasia even without the patient's okay, without their without the permission. I think a more possible consequence of if we just follow consistently a rule that it's okay to kill other people when they're in pain is that we're not going to care about death or about killing people. We're going to become insensitive to homicide, and that's kind of scary, you know. So basically, long story short here is you might get different answers to what's right or wrong if you apply act or rule utilitarianism. So again, act utilitarianism is all about the action. Every act, every action, you apply the principle of utility, which is the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. For rule utilitarianism, you apply that principle of utility to a rule that's guiding your actions. Okay, just like an extra step. It's kind of more indirect. And actually, more often than not, you're going to have almost opposite results of rightness or wrongness. So when an act utilitarian will say yes, the rule utilitarian will say no. Usually that's how it happens. I don't know why. Okay, so let's go back to Bentham. So Jeremy Bentham, right, he's just all about just happiness, right? And he has like a very simplistic, I said, notion of that, right? Some people say that he's like very one-dimensional in terms that all he cares about during Bentham and his hedonistic calculus or utilitarian calculus, however you want to put it, is the number, the quantity of happiness. That's all he cares about. Whereas John Stuart Mill kind of as a result of his experience with this depression and going in through this whole literature or romanticism, adds the second dimension. So it's not just quantity for John Stuart Mill, as it is for Bentham, but also quality for John Stuart Mill. So yes, the quantity, the amount of happiness is important. But what's also equally important is the kind of happiness, quality of happiness. So this might be like a dumb example here, but an example is that, you know, you might be equally as happy by reading a poem as eating a bucket of ice cream. Right? If you could like quantify it, put numbers on it. Right? You say, 8.7 happiness points. Right? The same amount, eating ice cream and reading a poem. So for Jeremy Bentham, both of those actions are right. And if you have to choose between those two, it really doesn't matter. They're both equally the same quantity. With John Stuart Mill, though, he's going to add the difference between quality, higher pleasures and lower pleasures. So for him, he's going to argue that reading poetry is more better, when I use that word, or best, or just better, right, than eating ice cream because of the quality of it. It's a higher pleasure. Right? It's about art and poetry, and it's about that. Right? So it's a higher pleasure than just eating. Even though it might be the same amount of happiness, you might feel the same amount of happiness after you're done. He will say that poetry is way better because the quality is higher. So again, John Stuart Mill adds that dimension of not just quantity, but quality as well. And this is what he says, John Stuart Mill. And I'll read from his quote here. And it's actually kind of good. He says, when in terms of equality, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So I'll repeat that one more time. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So what he's saying here is that, a fool who doesn't know better might think that eating the ice cream is it's more happiness. It's a better right. Because he's just a fool, he doesn't know better. But Socrates, he's not going to be happy with just eating ice cream. He's going to want the poetry, the poem as well. So this is what he's saying, right? We as human beings, we have these higher faculties, and we should strive for that. It's not just happiness in a simple formula as adding happiness, as in quantifying it. There's a type of happiness. What kind of happiness? So this also goes into like character, like what kind of character you are. And at the end of the day, the best way to find out what is a good higher pleasure and lower pleasure, he's an empiricist, John Stuart Mill. He says to experience them. You have to experience lower pleasures and higher pleasures as well, so that you'll be able to make a rational decision. And he says that it's just more rational that you're going to choose a higher pleasure. That everybody's going to choose that, if they use their human faculties. I'm hoping this makes sense. So, this is all what utilitarianism is all about. Damn, that's a hard word. It's just increasing happiness for everybody. And again, I must emphasize the last part. Everybody. Right? It's not just for yourself. Right? It's not just this egoistic pursuit of happiness. It's about being impartial. It's about being fair. It's about moral equality. Everybody's equal. Your status, your wealth, your gender, your sexuality, whatever, that doesn't matter. Everybody's equal. And that's something you gotta take into account. So let me see. I'm thinking about an example here to give you. Yeah, I can't really think about this moral equality. So everyone's needs or interests have to have equal weight. Right? We need to be impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. As in, we don't have any interest in these things, in our actions. It's all about everybody's happiness and interest, and maximizing that for everybody, not just some or you, but to everyone equally. So moral equality, right, is really a strength of this utilitarian theory. Oh, I can't say that today. And that's basically it. Um, I mean, I don't know what else to add about utilitarianism. I mean, there are some critiques about this theory. Um, some of our more obvious critiques is, that some things are just wrong, right? Just common sense, right? Which we call in ethics we call them considered moral judgments. So everybody's just moral judgments, just common sense, right? Stipulates that murder is wrong. So let me give you this example, this scenario. So there's a guy who's being charged for raping a little girl, right? And you finally get him, right? You put him in jail, and this is a small little town. So the whole town finds out about this, and they want to lynch the guy. They want to get him out of jail and kill him like now, because of what he did is just horrendous, right? So think about this, right? This guy is being charged with this crime, this horrendous crime, raping and mutilating. I don't know. Just think of just some horrible shit to a little girl, right? And everybody just wants to, justice, immediate justice. But you're the sheriff of the town, and you want to follow the law, right? Due process. You want to give this guy, his day in court. But you know that if you don't give up this guy to the mob outside, to the lynch mob, it's going to become a riot, and there might be even more deaths than just this one guy, right? It might, people might get so angry outside and so vengeful that it's going to create a riot, and many more people are going to die than just this one person. So here's the dilemma. Here's a question: do you give up this guy to the lynch mob to avoid, chaos in the town, or do you go and do your actual duty and follow the law and go to the court proceedings and everything, knowing that if you do that, you take your time, it might create chaos, right? So what do? You give them up to control the town and avoid more chaos, or you go through your legal duty and maybe you create more deaths. Well, let me add this to the scenario. Uh, you find out that he's innocent, but the people are just too wild up already that they don't care about that, right? So what do? You give up an innocent person to avoid a riot in town, or do you do your duty as a sheriff and do justice and go to court and everything? That's one scenario, right? It's like not utilitarianism would say that give them up, kill him for the better good of everybody. But like Kantian, somebody who's all about duty, we're like, no, you gotta do your job. You gotta do your legal, there's your duty to do. And just allowing a mob to kill this person is just wrong. Right? So it goes kind of, sometimes utilitarianism goes against what are considered moral judgments. And there's more scenarios that goes against this. And I'm going to give you some scenarios for the discussion, and we'll see what you say. Are you a Kantian, or you are a utilitarian? Do you think that the action itself is what determines what is good or wrong, or the consequence of the action? These are the two things we're dealing with right now. Right? And this is all for this lecture. All right? You guys have a nice night, and we'll see you later.